In June of 1870, the city of Atlantic City spent exactly $5,000, half its entire annual tax revenue that year, to lay down 8-foot-wide wooden planks along a single mile of beachfront. The planks sat 1 foot above the sand in a herringbone pattern, could be taken up each winter, and solved a problem that had plagued the new resort since its first trains arrived. Sand tracked from the beach into hotel lobbies and railroad cars. Railroad conductor Alexander Boardman and hotel owner Jacob Keim had pitched the idea to city council, and within weeks the boardwalk became the spine of the place. That modest $5,000 investment, funded out of a town still barely on the map, turned out to be the cheapest and most consequential piece of infrastructure Atlantic City would ever build. It kept the sand out, gave visitors a clean promenade, and created the stage on which the city's entire story would play out for the next century and a half. The story begins 40 years earlier on Absecon Island, a low, sandy spit that the Lenni Lenape had known as Absegami, and that English settlers valued at 4 cents an acre. In 1783, Jeremiah Leeds, a farmer from Leeds Point, built the first year-round house there, a simple cedar log cabin near what would later become Baltic Avenue. His family raised corn and rye, ran a small tavern after he died, and kept the island sparsely settled. By the 1820s, only a handful of Leeds descendants still lived on the island. Then a Philadelphia-trained physician named Dr. Jonathan Pitney moved to the mainland village of Absecon and began spending his summers there. Pitney became convinced the salt air and sea breezes could cure consumption and other urban ailments. He started writing letters and buttonholing investors, arguing that Absecon Island could become a health resort if only people could reach it. In 1852, Pitney found the man who could make the trip possible. Richard B. Osborne, a civil engineer from Philadelphia hired to survey a railroad route through the Jersey Pine Barrens, looked at Pitney's map and saw the straight-line distance of 62 miles from Camden to the island. Osborne calculated that a rail line could deliver Philadelphians to the ocean in 2.5 hours. He drew the city grid himself, streets named after the world's oceans running parallel to the beach, avenues named after the states crossing them, and even printed the name Atlantic City on the first official map. On March 19, 1852, the state legislature granted a charter to the Camden and Atlantic Railroad Company. Construction began that year at a total cost that would reach $1,274,000. On May 1, 1854, the city was formally incorporated with just 18 voters. Chalkley S. Leeds, Jeremiah's son, was elected the first mayor. 2 months later, on July 1, 1854, the first train from Camden arrived, carrying paying passengers who stepped off into a town that still had only 7 permanent dwellings. The railroad changed the arithmetic overnight. Land that had been worth pennies an acre suddenly had buyers. The first commercial hotel, the Bellow House at Massachusetts and Atlantic Avenues, opened in 1853 and operated until 1902. By 1860, the permanent population had reached 687, and the summer crowds were already straining the single rail line. Nearly 500,000 passengers a year were arriving by the mid-1870s, each one tracking sand that the new hotels could not afford to ignore. That was when Boardman and Keim's $5,000 boardwalk proved its worth. It kept the sand out of lobbies and railroad cars, and it gave visitors a clean, elevated promenade where they could stroll without ruining their shoes. Within a decade, the original mile had been widened and lengthened, and by 1880 a second, more permanent version replaced the temporary planks. The boardwalk had become the city's calling card. The money that flowed in from those rail passengers funded everything else. In 1878, the United States Hotel opened on a full city block between Atlantic, Pacific, Delaware, and Maryland Avenues. Owned by the railroad itself, it was built while the tracks were still being laid. One wing stood ready before the rest of the building existed. It could sleep 2,000 guests, covered 14 acres of grounds, and quickly became the largest hotel in the country. Smaller boarding houses and rooming houses multiplied along the side streets. The First National Bank of Atlantic City opened its doors in 1881. Electricity arrived the following year when a single streetlight was switched on in front of Coon Lee's Hall at Atlantic and South Carolina Avenues. The Atlantic City Beach Patrol, the first professional lifeguard service in the nation, began operations in 1881 with 20 guards by its second season. Trolley service started in 1893 and reached Ventnor by 1900. In 1898, the Atlantic City Hospital opened its doors, and the Carnegie-funded public library followed in 1900. Each new amenity was paid for by the same basic equation. Railroad fares plus hotel rooms plus meals plus souvenirs equaled tax revenue that could be spent on still more amenities. By the 1890s, the boardwalk itself had become a commercial engine. Rolling chairs, wicker seats pushed by attendants, made their debut in 1887 and soon numbered in the hundreds. Easter parades drew thousands onto the planks each spring, and in 1898 the Steel Pier opened at the foot of Virginia Avenue, billed from the start as the showplace of the nation. It extended 500 feet into the ocean and featured theaters, restaurants, and eventually a diving horse act that would become legendary. The pier was built on the same principle that had justified the first boardwalk: give visitors something to do once they stepped off the train, and they would spend more money before they stepped back on. Saltwater taffy had its accidental birth in 1880 when a storm flooded David Bradley's shop and a little girl asked for some of the saltwater taffy that had washed ashore. The name stuck, and soon taffy shops lined the boardwalk, turning a simple candy into a signature souvenir shipped home by the boxful. The early years of the 20th century turned those modest hotels into palaces. In 1902, Josiah White III, whose family already ran several smaller establishments, bought land at Ohio Avenue and the boardwalk and opened the Queen Anne-style Marlborough House. 3 years later, he hired the Philadelphia architects Price and McClanahan to design an entirely new wing. The Blenheim, as it was called, was built of reinforced concrete at a time when steel was in short supply, and recent hotel fires had made everyone nervous. When it opened in 1906, the Blenheim was one of the largest reinforced concrete structures in the world, its domes and towers giving the boardwalk a skyline that could be seen for miles. The White family kept expanding. Across the street, the Traymore Hotel, originally a 10-room wooden boarding house, opened in 1879 at Illinois and Pacific Avenues, had grown to 450 rooms by 1898. In 1914 and 1915, the Whites' half-brother Daniel rebuilt it entirely in concrete, 16 stories tall, with tan brick and gold-capped towers that earned it the nickname the Sand Castle by the Sea. The new Traymore boasted 600 rooms and ocean-facing balconies for nearly every guest. These were not cheap projects. Concrete and steel and imported finishes ran into the millions even then, but the returns justified the outlay. A single summer season could fill every room at premium rates, and the boardwalk foot traffic outside guaranteed steady revenue from restaurants, shops, and concessions below. Population numbers tell the scale of the bet. In 1900, the city had 27,838 permanent residents, up from a mere 250 just 45 years earlier. By 1910, that figure had jumped to 46,150. By 1920, it stood at 50,707. The railroad had done its job too well. The city was no longer a seasonal health resort, but a year-round destination that still exploded every summer. In 1921, the first Miss America pageant was held on the boardwalk as a 2-day bathing beauty contest to extend the tourist season past Labor Day. 16-year-old Margaret Gorman of Washington, D.C., won the Golden Mermaid Trophy and $5,000 in prize money. The contest quickly became an annual fixture, drawing national press and still more visitors who wanted to see the winner crowned in person. The 1920s marked the city's undisputed golden age. Mayor Edward L. Bader, elected in 1920, pushed through a public referendum in 1923 that led to a $1.5 million bond issue for Convention Hall. Ground was broken, and on May 31, 1929, the finished building, later known as Boardwalk Hall, was dedicated. It was then the largest auditorium in the world without interior columns, capable of seating more than 12,000 and hosting everything from political conventions to boxing matches. The boardwalk itself had grown to nearly 7 miles, stretching south through Ventnor and Margate to Longport. On any given summer evening in those years, you could stand at the railing near Steel Pier and watch the lights of the amusement palaces stretch into the distance while the ocean rolled in below. The air smelled of saltwater taffy and roasting peanuts and the faint ozone of the electric lights. Rolling chair attendants called out for fares. Jazz bands played from hotel ballrooms, and the crowds moved shoulder to shoulder past the Marlborough-Blenheim, the Traymore, the Chalfonte-Haddon Hall, and the Claridge, which opened in 1930 as the skyscraper by the sea with its 24-story tower. The Chalfonte House had opened in 1868 as a 3-story wooden Quaker rooming house at North Carolina Avenue and Pacific Avenue, built for $21,000 on land purchased for $6,500. The neighboring Haddon House followed in 1869. By 1904, the Leeds Company had rebuilt the Chalfonte as an 8-story iron frame and brick skyscraper costing $1 million. Atlantic City's first true high-rise. The Haddon Hall was expanded in stages and completed in 1929 at 11 stories. Together, they formed the Chalfonte-Haddon Hall Complex, a massive operation that could accommodate thousands and would later play a central role in the city's next chapter. These hotels were not isolated buildings. They anchored entire blocks of commerce. The Morton Hotel near Steel Pier on Virginia Avenue hosted celebrities appearing in the pier's main showroom or the Marine Ballroom. The Albemarle and the Brighton, built in 1873 at Indiana Avenue, and the Boardwalk as the first year-round hotel, drew repeat guests who came for the same ocean view and the same reliable service year after year. Prohibition only added to the allure. While the rest of the country went dry after 1920, Atlantic City looked the other way. Enoch L. Nucky Johnson, the city's political boss and Atlantic County treasurer, took in as much as $500,000 a year in kickbacks from liquor, gambling, and prostitution that operated openly behind the respectable facade of the hotels. In 1929, he hosted a meeting of the National Crime Syndicate on the boardwalk. Al Capone was photographed there in a straw boater and linen suit. The money from those enterprises helped keep the hotels full even during the early years of the Depression. Population hit its all-time high of 66,198 in 1930, and African-American migrants from the South made up nearly a quarter of the city's residents, the highest proportion of any city in New Jersey. They found work in the hotels as bellhops, cooks, and laundresses, and on the north side of town along Kentucky Avenue, a vibrant nightlife district of clubs. Club Harlem, the Paradise, Grace's Little Belmont, catered to both black and white visitors after dark. One former resident recalled the sound of jazz spilling out onto the sidewalks until dawn, the clink of glasses, and the steady hum of conversation that made Kentucky Avenue feel like the liveliest street in America after the boardwalk itself. The boardwalk remained the constant. It absorbed the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944, which tore away more than half its length and sent sections of railing and benches blocks inland. Yet within months, crews were laying new planks, and the piers were open again. The diving horses still plunged into their tanks at Steel Pier, introduced there in 1920 and drawing crowds for decades. The Miss America contestants still paraded, and the big hotels still booked conventions that brought thousands of delegates who spent money on everything from lobster dinners to saltwater taffy shipped home in souvenir boxes. The city had built an economy on the simple promise that if you could reach the ocean in comfort, you would pay handsomely for the privilege. By the late 1940s, the boardwalk had been rebuilt wider and stronger, 60 feet across in places, reinforced with steel and concrete, and it carried the weight of the city's ambitions as surely as it had in 1870. After World War II, the math began to shift. Automobiles and the new interstate highways let families drive straight to the shore without buying a train ticket. Commercial air travel made Miami Beach and the Caribbean reachable in the same time it once took to reach Atlantic City. The grand hotels that had been built for permanence started to feel expensive to maintain. The Traymore, once the pride of the boardwalk, stood vacant and deteriorating by the early 1970s. In April 1972, it was imploded in a controlled demolition that held a Guinness record for the largest building ever brought down that way. The site was cleared for a parking lot. Other landmarks followed. The carrying costs, property taxes, insurance, heating, and constant repairs had outrun the revenue from a shrinking seasonal trade. Population, which had already slipped below 50,000 by 1960, continued to fall in every census for the next 40 years. In 1976, New Jersey voters approved a referendum allowing casino gambling, but only inside Atlantic City. The promise was straightforward. The new industry would generate tax revenue to revive the city without spreading statewide. On May 26, 1978, Resorts International opened the state's first legal casino inside the old Chalfonte Haddon Hall. The Marlborough-Blenheim, still owned by the White family after more than 70 years, closed its doors in October 1977 after a farewell gala. Reese Pally and Martin Blatt had bought it with plans to spend $35 million on renovations. Within weeks, Bally Manufacturing leased the property for 40 years, purchased the neighboring Dennis Hotel for $4 million, and announced an $83 million casino hotel complex. Instead of renovating, Bally chose to demolish. On January 5, 1979, 650 charges of dynamite brought down the Blenheim wing in a cloud of dust visible for miles. The site at Ohio Avenue and the boardwalk became Bally's Park Place. The boardwalk that had once been built to protect wooden hotels now ran past steel and glass casinos, whose slot machines and tables generated revenue the old resorts could never have matched.
For a time, the numbers looked promising. By the early 1990s, Atlantic City was drawing 33 million visitor trips a year, more than any other American destination. Casinos employed more than 50,000 people at their peak and provided two-thirds of the city's tax base. Gross gaming revenue hit $5.2 billion in 2006. Casino Reinvestment Development Authority funds, generated by a 1.25% reinvestment obligation on gaming revenues, poured $1.5 billion into Atlantic City projects between 1985 and 2008, plus another $300 million statewide. Yet the same market logic that had once built the grand hotels now worked against the city. Pennsylvania, New York, and Connecticut legalized casinos of their own. Internet gambling arrived. The 2008 financial crisis cut discretionary spending. One by one, the older casinos began to close. In 2014, 4 shut their doors in a single year: the Atlantic Club on January 13th, Showboat on August 31st, Revel on September 2nd, and Trump Plaza on September 16th, costing nearly 8,000 jobs. Casino revenue fell below $3 billion for the first time in 22 years in 2013, dropping to $2.74 billion in 2014. The Sands, which had replaced an earlier hotel, was imploded in 2007. Its site sat empty for years. Revenues fell to $2.9 billion by 2013. The boardwalk, still lined with the surviving casinos, saw foot traffic drop as visitors stayed inside the newer properties or simply stayed home.
Today, if you stand at the corner of Ohio Avenue and the boardwalk, you see the towers of Bally's where the Marlborough-Blenheim once rose. Nothing marks the spot where 650 sticks of dynamite ended one of the largest reinforced concrete buildings of its era. A block away, the Steel Pier still juts into the ocean, though the diving horse is long gone. The boardwalk itself stretches on, 60 feet wide in places, its planks still laid in that same herringbone pattern first used in 1870. On a quiet weekday morning in the off-season, you can walk its length and hear only the gulls and the occasional wave. The city's permanent population now hovers just above 38,500, roughly what it was in the 1880s before the grand hotels went up. The convention hall that cost $1.5 million in 1920s bonds still stands, renamed Boardwalk Hall, hosting concerts instead of the Democratic National Convention that once spotlighted the city's troubles. If you walk a little farther north to the site of the old United States Hotel, now occupied by the Showboat parking lot, you can still see traces of the rail line that once delivered 500,000 passengers a year. The tracks are gone, but the right-of-way remains a quiet corridor through the modern city. The boardwalk remains, the one piece of infrastructure that outlasted every hotel, every pier, every boom, and every bust. It was built to solve a practical problem: sand in the lobbies and it became the stage on which the entire story played out. The trains no longer pull up beside it. The rolling chairs are fewer. The crowds that once filled it shoulder to shoulder have thinned. Yet on a summer evening when the lights come on and the ocean breeze moves across the planks, you can still stand at the railing and feel the faint echo of what the city once bet everything on. That if you gave people a clean, safe, elevated path to the sea, they would come and they would spend, and the numbers would always add up in the end. The planks are still there, laid end to end, waiting for the next calculation.